Welcome to the Stray Pointers podcast, where seemingly ordinary people join us for extraordinary discussions. You're listening to Season 1, Episode 11 of the Stray Pointers podcast. This episode of the Stray Pointers podcast was recorded on November 10th, 2023. I'm your host, Jim Lawless. For links to items referenced in the podcast, please see the show notes for this episode at straypointers.com. Joining us today is Elizabeth K. Joseph, who leads the Open Source Program Office for IBM Z series mainframe systems. Liz, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Liz, I've seen you on social media. I've listened to some of your talks. I've seen some of the stuff you've posted. I wanted to talk a little bit about the formative years of tech for you, and that what I'm talking about would predate your involvement in the Linux community. What type of tech or did tech interest you at all prior to Linux?
So I was kind of one of those lonely kids in high school, and I spent a lot of time in the library and in the computer lab. And that was kind of where I got started. This is the late 90s. And it was I kind of went there because that's where the books were, but then I sort of got into computers. And this was, I'm thinking like 1998, I made my own website. So this was in the years of GeoCities and Angel Fire. So I had just a free little website. So my first foray into technology was doing HTML, basically.
Okay.
And then I joined some the old IRC Internet Relay Chat. And there's a scripting language that goes with some of the clients. So I started doing some scripting because I wanted to have a little bot in my chat channel. So
was that egg drop?
No, so I got into that later. I was actually just using MIRC on Windows.
Okay, I actually used the scripting language with that. I just refer to it as Merc. I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce it.
I don't know how you're supposed to say it either.
we one of the companies I had worked for, we had done a internet relay chat job site, so sort of a job hosting thing, and the scripting language was invaluable so that when people came into a certain channel, we could automate the greeting and do all kinds of interesting stuff there.
Yeah, exactly.
So before computers, was there ever any interest in tech? Because I know that some of the things you've said is you have an interest in trains and you have an interest in repairing old typewriters. Did those interests predate the discovery of computer systems?
Not really. I mean, I kind of always had a curiosity about how things worked. And my father had an old typewriter when I was growing up. But my father was very influential in my formative years because he was interested in ham radios. I don't know if he ever got his license, but I know we had a bunch of old ham equipment in our garage growing up. And he was really into woodworking. He used to build doll houses.
Okay.
So I had a dollhouse. So I he was really into woodworking and things. So I was always fascinated with how things come together and how things work. And I think that really led into my life in computers as well.
Okay. So you started with your own website and IRC and had a growing interest in the internet. What led you to Linux?
So I think I was in an IRC channel, and it was a science fiction IRC channel. And so the attendees to that, the participants in that channel were kind of geeky as it was. And they started dabbling in Linux. So when I started meeting some people in real life, we called it.
Right.
And one of them, showed me his Linux laptop, and I was like, oh, I don't even think it was a laptop at the time because Wi-Fi didn't work, but a Linux desktop. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. And the one thing that really stood out at me, this is like the year 2000, is that on Windows I couldn't really customize anything, like my desktop environment. But he had this setup where it was just a plain desktop background, and you'd like right click to launch something, and that's all he had on his screen. It was super minimalistic, and I was like, that's really cool. And I got it installed on my computer, and I remember I was using Enlightenment, which is a windowing environment, and I could have no icons on my screen. It was beautiful. I started using keyboard shortcuts, and then there was a widget on there that I wanted to use, but it didn't quite do what I wanted. And so one of my friends showed me how to get the source code, because it was all open source, and then how to make edits to it. And it was written in C, and I'd never used C before. But, drawing from past scripting experience, I kind of cobbled together how to figure out the solution. I was able to make the change to the application, recompile it, and now it worked the way I wanted to. And that basically had me hooked for life. I was like,
So you said you installed Linux. Did you give up on Windows at that point?
I didn't. I kept Windows around for a while, partially because I liked playing games, video games on Windows. And at the time, there was a lot of stuff that didn't work on Linux. The world was really based around Windows on the desktop. It wasn't. I think it was probably around 2007 that I got rid of my Windows install.
Okay. So you were a power user hobbyist. How did things proceed that took you down the path of actually earning a living using Linux?
So I was attending the Linux. There's a Linux users group in Philadelphia that I started going to around 2001 when I moved to Philadelphia. And from there, I met a lot of people who were hobbyists. And actually, the guy who ran the Linux users group had a company. So he noticed my interest in Linux, and he was very into diversity and inclusion and trying to get non-traditional folks into tech. So he would hire a lot of people from our community who had non-traditional backgrounds. Either we didn't go to college, or we were women or people of color. And that was kind of his life mission, was to help some of us get into tech. And so I started racking servers for his company. So he would be like, hey, come pick up this server, bring it to a data center or a closet or like tiny server room in this university. Here's the Debian CD, go install Linux on it. So I started doing contract work for him probably in 2005, 2006. And then eventually I got hired full time at that company, where I worked for about 6 years.
Okay.
And it was a really great opportunity because he sort of let me set my own path. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do programming or if I was more interested in Linux systems administration, because I didn't go to university for any of this, so I didn't really know what the paths looked like. And that's something I still encounter today when I'm introducing people to tech. And they're like, I don't even know what my options are. So he kind of let me dabble in different things. So dabble in programming, dabble in infrastructure. And I solidly went into infrastructure. I was like, I love taking pieces and putting them together. So building out infrastructure on Linux was really my passion, and still is.
Okay. Now you say you didn't take any classes at college. Do you have a college education or a post-high school education?
I don't, not at all.
So this is all self-taught, attained on the job knowledge,
Yep.
that sort of thing. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Now, you wrote a couple of books on Linux. You wrote a book that I believe has a couple of editions on Ubuntu, and then a book on OpenStack. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. So I worked on a couple of editions of the Ubuntu book. And then when I was working on OpenStack several years ago, I was working on the infrastructure team for the project. And as I was doing that, I was gathering a lot of knowledge. So the one led to the other. So I was working on the Ubuntu book, and then the editor was like, hey, you work on OpenStack for your job. Do you want to write a book? And I'm like, yeah, let's do it.
So you were at you were at HP at this time?
Right. Yep.
How did that gig happen?
So I'd been working for that tech services provider in Philadelphia, and I kind of found, so I moved to California at some point while I was working there. It was all remote. So I just told him one day, I'm like, hey, I'm moving to California. And my boss was like, okay, can you still work for me? Yeah, sure. But I think once I got to San Francisco, I was kind of, I wanted to explore my options. And I told him, I'm like, I've been with the company for 6 years. It was great. But I'm going to explore opportunities here. And he's like, it's about time. So it was actually a very friendly departure. And that's when I found the job at HP. So I told my friends, I was able to publicly do a job search at this point, because I kind of told my boss, like, I'm going to start looking, and he was very supportive. So I reached out to my open source community and people I knew really on social media. And I said, hey, I like doing Linux infrastructure and I like open source. What should I do? And so a friend of mine in the Ubuntu community reached out to me and he said, well, I'm at HP now and we are building up an infrastructure team to support this open source project, OpenStack. Would you like to, come have an interview? And I did, and I was hired. And it was pretty amazing because at that point I had been doing a lot of, sort of closed source infrastructure work. So, we were building servers for companies and such.
Mhm.
But this allowed me to do all of the infrastructure work, like all of our Puppet configurations, all of our Ansible configurations, all of our configuration files in general were all just in GitHub. And so I was able to meld the open source side of things, not just open source project work, but also the infrastructure work that I was doing. So for about 4 years there, like everything I did was open source.
And then people wanted to know how to do this, of course. So that led to speaking engagements.
Right. And I kind of spoke with HP. I'm like, hey, if I get a talk accepted somewhere, will you pay for me to travel to that conference and, take the time to do it? And they're like, sure, absolutely, of course. And I'm like, okay, how often can I do this? And they're like, how often can you get a talk accepted? So I was like, challenge accepted. And I ended up at that point started traveling really like 25% of the time. I was gone like 1 week a month, going to various conferences and speaking. And this was kind of at the beginning of where open source infrastructure was starting to take off, and GitOps and putting your code directly on Git repositories. So that was pretty much where my focus was in these early speaking engagements.
So this sort of started your career in Linux evangelism and open source evangelism then, yes?
Yeah. And I'd done little talks at the Linux users group or at small regional events. But this is, I think, really where I hit my stride and found really where my passion was.
Okay. So then as your career path continued, you found yourself on an IBM mainframe in running Linux on Z series hardware. Can you explain to me how that happened?
Yeah, that's a kind of funny story. So I've been doing all this stuff on the cloud and, writing open source software for the cloud and everything, and very focused on that. So I spent a little time working at a container startup in San Francisco after HP. And then I was looking for something different. So again, I sort of reached out to my contacts in the community and said, hey, I want a new challenge. And I wasn't really interested in pursuing the container angle much further, just because it wasn't as interesting to me as some of the other work I was doing. But everyone was into containers at the time, but I was like, I don't know, like I want something different. So I started interviewing around, and one of the interviews I took was with IBM, and I said, with their mainframe division. And at first I was like, this is like way out of my league. I don't know what a mainframe is. It's maybe too complicated hardware wise for me because I've never really gone into that space. But at the same time, I wanted the challenge. So that's when I was like, all right, let's do this. I talked to some people on their technical teams, and I joined that about 4.5 years ago. So
Okay. So I had a dalliance with Linux on Z series. They referred to it as Z Linux, and this has been probably 15 years ago. So it was probably some of their earliest efforts. Back then, I believe you had to have some specialty CPs to be added to the mainframe in order to run Linux. And the choices were Turbo Linux, SUSE Enterprise, and I don't know if Red Hat was called Enterprise yet or not, but it was a version of Red Hat. Am I to understand that now you can run Linux without those specialty CPs?
That's right. So the specialty CPs still exist. They're called IFLs, Integrated Facility for Linux. And you can think of those kind of as a subset of the general CP. So you can run Linux on your regular IBM Telum chip inside, but you can also get the specialized Linux ones. And the benefit of those is they're cheaper because you can't run ZOS on them. And so what IBM ended up doing several years ago is we now have a Linux only mainframe. So we have the standard line of the Z series systems, and those can run Linux or ZOS or whatever else you want to run on those.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the product line called Linux One, and Linux One is all IFLs, all Linux, can't run anything else on them. And they're orange instead of blue.
Do you need IFLs to run Linux on the mainframe?
No, you don't.
So what kinds of workloads are people running in Linux and the mainframe?
So it's very focused on data. And I like it's a funny story telling the story kind of mainframe, because you think of it back in the day, 1960s, the only companies that needed computers essentially were ones that were processing data. They're processing personnel records or flight records or healthcare records. Like, it's all the companies that had to do data. Companies that weren't working with data didn't need computers. And the thing that's changed today is that every company uses data. So IBM kind of accidentally made this machine in the 1960s that is so incredibly relevant today, because even like my cousin is an artist and he uses data analysis to help sell his art. And I'm like, people who are creative now even are using data analysis. And so the CPU and the structure of the CPU is really built around doing really fast efficient data processing. So to get really low level on it, like there's a really complicated cache system on the hardware itself. So you can load up a ton of data and have a lot of data processing on these CPUs all at once. So you see a lot of companies, so still the traditional ones that are doing, vast volumes of data processing, like the airlines and healthcare industry and insurance and whatnot. But a lot of companies, even startups who are doing a lot of data processing, are coming into the fold. And this latest chip that comes in the mainframes today, it has an AI accelerator. And so that has special access to the cache. So you can run AI and machine learning workloads. And again, like, it's just the same technology of fast processing of data just keeps reinventing itself and becoming more important and relevant to the world. So
Now,
that's
is this more performant than the equivalent Intel x86 64 gear?
I mean, it depends answer. But it's for really fast data processing, and also in the realm of AI, people like to bring up things like GPUs and stuff. So there's sort of two components of machine learning. There's the training and development of a model, and then there's the execution of the model. And what the mainframe is really good at is that execution, the inferencing. So it takes a model, which you can train anywhere. You can train it on the mainframe. We have the tooling there for it. But then, like, when you actually are, a credit card company and you're processing those transactions and looking for fraud on those live transactions, that's really where the mainframe is going to shine with these new accelerators and fast data processing.
Now, is there interoperability with traditional mainframe workloads then, with CICS and that sort of thing?
There is, and there's a lot of work being done there, because the mainframe sort of generation, it's funny when I encounter people working on mainframe, they're either in their 50s and above or in their 20s. It kind of skipped over a couple generations. Yeah. And so me, like, I'm right in the middle there. And I there's not many people my age working on mainframe, just because I think college is, scaled back from it with the rise of the microcomputer and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But the 20-year-olds, I mean, they're coming out of college and they have a very different view of writing code and environments they're writing code in. And so they're less tolerant of the green screens that the folks in the industry are used to using. And so there's a lot of work being done to modernize the platform and get a lot of new interactions in there. But we're still using, Kix and a lot of the older programming language. There's a lot of COBOL as well. But
Mm-hmm.
you can edit COBOL code in VS Code now. And you can pull in, there's a open source project called the Open Mainframe Project, and they
Mm-hmm.
have a tool called Zoe, which is kind of the flagship tooling, and that allows you to interact with a lot of the older things. And so actually that VS Code plugin for COBOL uses Zoe in the that's how it connects to the mainframe essentially.
Now, does the ASCII versus, or ASCII UTF-8 versus EBCDIC, does that come into play as far as a challenge for interoperability?
A little bit, but less so these days. I think a lot of those problems were solved about a decade ago. And so when you do run into those problems, it's very clear that that's what the problem is, and there's usually a tool to fix it.
Okay. Okay. So you told me that you told me via email that you're learning COBOL now. How new are you to COBOL?
So I went through the first, the Open Mainframe project also has a COBOL course. So I went through the first sort of module of that several months ago. So I'm kind of learning it academically. I haven't actually really put anything into production or touched production code. And I think that's where the real learning happens.
Sure.
Because the thing to know about COBOL is it's a domain specific language, and it's really built around modifying the data sets that you have. And so everything you do in COBOL, like you can learn the syntax and you can learn the idea behind it and like how it works from an academic perspective, like I have done. But until you get to an actual real data set, that is where you have to learn more. So anyone who learns COBOL, you can kind of learn some basics, but then you have to learn the data environment that you're working in. And that's kind of the next step. And that's not how far I've gotten yet.
Okay. I think that's an interesting perspective and interesting calling it a domain specific language. And I don't think you're wrong. COBOL comes up every once in a while in the tech communities. And I think that the younger folks trying to get a grasp of it are loading GNU COBOL and playing with it a little bit. And I think the absence of that mainframe environment is what's really missing. I think you need to see it in context and understand how performant it is, how the code is really optimal for mainframes and that sort of thing. Now, do you plan to run COBOL workloads on Linux?
Not really. You mentioned interoperability previously. So what we end up doing most of the time is we still run COBOL on ZOS, and then we export it through something, through one of the connectors, and then we do additional processing on the Linux side, or we stash it in a MongoDB database or something, or we put it closer to the front end, but then the system of record is still on the mainframe in that COBOL.
What would you say then the advantages are of running Linux on the mainframe versus an Intel hardware setup or just one of the major cloud providers?
So the one thing that I've noticed in looking at some of these modernization efforts is that proximity to data is incredibly important, like physical proximity. It's important for fast transactions, and it's also important for cost. So when you're using a cloud environment, you're paying for all of the data to be moved around between your different components, and getting that out to your customers. And so if you have it all in your series of data centers, like on-prem, that reduces the length of time it takes to get your data from one place to another. And when you're talking about petabytes of data, that becomes incredibly important, and very expensive. So what we've been seeing a lot of is a hybrid approach. So there's a little bit of cloud, there's a little bit of Linux on the mainframe, and there's probably still a lot of ZOS.
Sure.
And then it's just a a high level view of like what makes sense from a cost and logistical perspective. So a lot of stuff is still staying on the mainframe, and then sort of the next step is doing that Linux on Z thing, and then integrating the cloud into that.
What's on the horizon for your future Linux open systems endeavors?
So I have started dabbling in the AI space a little bit, and that's been really interesting because the AI workflow on Linux on Z is very focused on open source tooling. So you develop the model, you put it into this Onyx format, which is an open source, open standards format, and then that gets fed directly into the processor that manages all that stuff. So it's all, and you can use any backend. You can use TensorFlow or PyTorch or whatever sort of open source tooling you're using, or there's a bunch of proprietary ones too, but that all can go into the Onyx format. And I love that it's all open, which has allowed me to dabble with it and also do like workshops and things with folks in the community just so they can try it out, which is, Mainframe has always had this kind of history of open source, even before open source was created as a term. Like the main conference, like Mainframe conference, is called Share. And I think the tagline is like, share is not just what we're called, it's what we do. And so they've always been sharing software and stuff. And that was, you're thinking back to the 1950s, 1960s at this time, computer companies weren't software companies yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so this has kind of been an evolution. And I talk about now, like entering the sort of renaissance of open source in the mainframe technology and in the mainframe space. And that's been really exciting for me to be a part of that because, of course, I love open source. So being able to use all the AI tooling and open source tool that's open source has been really cool for me. And that's kind of where I'm going to be focusing my efforts in the next few months, probably. And
Okay, so how does a modern mainframe programmer well, I'll split this into two questions. Get started with something like this, and then how do they turn it into a skunkwork project to bring it into their organization?
so there's a lot of free training out there, but the one place I'd point people to first of all is IBM Z Explore. That gets you an account on a mainframe and walks you through a bunch of different technologies that are available through that. And it's mostly done through VS Code. So you download VS Code and then you would do that interaction. It uses Zoe as the mediator. And it kind of exposes the user to a bunch of different mainframe technologies. And then from there, I've had calls with clients where they're like, okay, well, we don't want this, but we do want that. And by having that sort of introduction to the technologies that are there, they are able to sort of make a determination for their organization, and do some little skunkwork projects. We had an IBM Z Day last month, which was a free virtual event that we put on. And one of the clients that we brought on, they had some spare IFLs, the Linux processors in their organization that they weren't using. And so this little team got together. It was part of a government organization in Brazil. And they put Postgres on there and they started running some workloads and connecting it to their back end over on ZOS and doing a little bit of work on that. And now it is a key part of their infrastructure because it turns out that was really like as a mediation layer, like between the user and the back end, that Postgres install was really great and it scaled really well and they are running it all on Linux on Z.
Okay. Any closing thoughts for both of my listeners?
I mean, the big thing is I got into mainframe because I thought it was fascinating. And that's kind of how my entire career has been. It's been very not planned at all. I mean, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, even 5 years ago, if I'd been working on mainframes, I'd be like, I know. But it sparked my interest and I kind of pulled on that thread. And that really goes for everything that I work on. I mean, I just kind of get curious and then I get really deep into the technology and then I share it. I talk to people about it. I talk to you about it and I go on social media and I'd be like, hey guys, look at this cool thing that I found out about, whatever I'm working on. And sharing that and having that engagement and learning from other people around me, especially on social media, and through blogs and just being out there in the online community. Yeah, so follow your passion and then share it with everyone you know, even if they don't want to hear about it.
Good advice. Well, thank you very much for being on the show. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was great.
I'd like to thank Liz again for her time, and I'd like to thank you all for listening. Let's do this again soon. Take care.